Well, hello YouTube. How you doing? Well, you're here. Maybe you want to take a look at this guitar. Now, this is something a customer brought to me to have a restring and set up job. But when I looked at it, I discovered that there was a few more problems in the guitar than just that. Not his fault. This guitar, I think, was second hand before he got it. And it's just been years of neglect. Sort of little problems that could have been fixed at the time that weren't. And they've escalated to being problems that are a little bit more difficult to solve. So what I decided to do, the best thing I could do, was take the whole guitar down to its component parts, take everything off, and then put it all back together, making sure everything was correct. While it's like this, I thought this was a brilliant opportunity to show you the different parts of a guitar, what they do, and the things that can go wrong with them, and how you can fix it. Shall we get started? I think so. Roll titles. This is the guitar neck. I'm going to start here because this is one of the most important parts of the guitar. First thing I'll talk about is construction of guitar necks. There are three common ways to construct a guitar neck. Here is a bolt-on neck on another guitar, and you can see how it's constructed. The neck sits into a slot on the body and is secured by 4 screws. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but commonly 4 screws. You usually see this on cheap guitars, but that doesn't mean it's a bad construction method. Some very expensive guitars are made with this, and some people consider it to be the best style of attaching a neck to the body. This guitar has a set neck, or a glued in neck. It means the neck was once a separate part, and it's been slotted into the body and glued in place. So that neck can't be removed, but it's supposed to give a lot more sustain than a bolt-on neck, although some people do argue that it doesn't. You'll usually see this on Gibson models. They like to do set necks. The last construction method I want to speak about is the through neck. This is where, as you can see here, the neck woods run right the way through the guitar, all the way to the bottom, and the body is sort of glued on to either side of the neck. This is usually seen on much more expensive guitars, just because it's more difficult and more expensive to make guitars this way. Generally accepted that this style will give you the most sort of sustain out of your guitar, because the vibrations from the neck will travel right the way through the whole body, and all the hardware is attached to that middle neck column. So it should technically make the best guitars. Again, people will argue it doesn't. It's all down to sound and preference. Nothing is the best. One thing you may not know very much about if you're new to guitars, or don't know very much about guitars, is the neck profile. Now what that is on the back of the neck, where your thumb would be if you're playing the guitar, it's shaped. It's rounded, so it's easier to play. If you've played some vintage guitars, you'll realise that they feel very different on their neck profile to modern guitars. For example, if you're playing an old Fender, it might have a soft V style neck, whereas a modern Ibanez will have a very shallow U. When I say things like soft V or shallow U or modern C, it just describes the shape of the back of the neck, just how it curves round. If you want to play a lot of technical stuff, you might want a flatter profile, whereas if you're a more sort of old style blues player, you might want a thicker neck, chunkier neck. So yeah, be aware of that when you're trying guitars and playing guitars, that the neck profile might be different. Looking at the front of the neck, this wood here is called the fretboard, or sometimes the fingerboard, or sometimes just the board. It's where your fingers lie, it's where the frets are installed. So fingerboard, fretboard, or just board will do you. It's sometimes made from a separate piece of wood from the rest of the neck, like in this case, which is glued on the top of the neck for a different tone, sort of style, or for a different look. One thing about fretboards is that they are radiused, which means they have a curve in them. Maybe I can show you that here. You can just see the curve on the fretboard here. Now that radius just makes it easier to play. You don't want to be playing a flat neck, generally speaking. Different guitars have different radiuses. Old vintage guitars had a more profound radius, steeper radius, whereas modern guitars maybe have a flatter radius. If you're into your shred metal, then you'll have a flatter radius fretboard. Maybe if you're into old style jazz or blues with an old Fender guitar, you will have a steeper radius. So again, if you've played a lot of guitars, you maybe know this, you maybe felt this. If not, this is something that you should know about. You can maybe see here on the fretboard, if I just angle it to the light, there's damage to the fingerboard here and here, and also across here. Now this is up round about where you'd play G's and C's and D's, D chords, things like that. So some beginner person has had this guitar for a while and they've not cut their nails. That's what causes this sort of damage into the fingerboard. You don't want to be doing that. They've sort of been digging in with their nails, long nails, and it's damaged the wood. Cut your nails. Yeah, if you want to play guitar, have the nails short so they're not going over the top of your fingers. It just means that you can actually get to the strings better and it doesn't damage your fretboard as you try to play. Another important aspect of the neck is the frets. These are these metal bars that run across the neck and get closer and closer together as they get to the top here. The highest notes will be. These wires also come in different shapes and sizes. Nothing standard in the world of guitars, so you can get some small frets or some thick frets, wide frets. Again, sort of old sort of vintage guitars will maybe have narrow, small frets, whereas modern sort of metal orientated guitars will have thicker frets. It's generally getting accepted now that most guitar companies will have a sort of jumbo fret idea, sort of bigger frets, just because it's easier for string bending. The world of music and the way that we play guitar has changed a lot since guitars were first made, so the companies are starting to recognise that and make the guitars playable for every style of music, not just some. Again, problems with frets, you can see again up towards these D chord shapes, you can see that the strings have notched into the frets here, here and here, and again there. If you catch it in time, you can get a guitar repairman to level out the frets, re-crown them, and it's fine. But if you leave them too long, those pits get too deep, and if you tried to level them out, you'd end up with no fret left, and the frets need to be replaced, and that's more costly. So if you see this starting to happen to your frets, get it sorted, get it to a guitar repairman. Don't let it sit there, because you'll eventually get to the stage where you've got a hole in your fret so deep that you have to replace frets, and that's more expensive for you. It could be a lot cheaper and a lot easier to fix the frets before they get to that state. These dots here, the red on this guitar, sometimes white, sometimes black, depending on what kind of guitar you've got. These are inlays. They're generally made of plastic or sometimes shell, mother of pearl, all that sort of idea for the more expensive guitars. They just show you what frets you're playing, where your fingers are supposed to be. There's also little ones on the side so you can look down at the guitar from when you're playing it. They're just position markers to show you where your fingers are. They're just really aesthetic. They don't serve a purpose other than to show you where your fingers are. So you can make them as pretty or as simple as you like. And some guitars don't have any at all, which is cool if you know what you're doing. This here is called the nut. It's generally made from bone or brass, or on the cheap guitars like this one, plastic. Unfortunately, when I was taking the strings out, this one snapped, so there's a bit missing, so I'll have to replace that. Fortunately, I've got a little bit of bone sitting, so this guitar's going to end up a little bit better than it was before. This is just for the strings to run over, so that they're correctly spaced, and it also helps keep the height of the strings at this end of the neck. So it's a very important piece. This is one of the most important pieces of the guitar. If this is done wrongly, then your guitar's never going to sound right. This little chap here, poking out of the neck, this is the truss rod. This is a metal bar that runs all the way down the length of the neck. It's there to strengthen the neck, so that the tension of the strings doesn't snap the neck in half. It also is adjustable, so if your neck is bent, either forward or backwards, you can straighten it out by adjusting that truss rod. It's maybe something you don't want to do yourself, because it's very sensitive business and you don't want to snap your neck, and you can tighten the truss rod till you snap the truss rod or snap the neck. So something you maybe want to check out from a repairman. Usually if you send it into a guitar shop to be set up, they will restring it, and one of the things they'll do is check the neck is straight and check your truss rod. This here is the headstock. It's at the top of the neck, therefore it's the head. It makes sense, right? On the headstock we have these. Now these are tuning machines, or sometimes called tuning pegs, or machine heads, whatever you want to call them. They are what the strings go on to. You turn the buttons here, yep, and you tighten the string and loosen the string and bring it into pitch. So everyone should be familiar with these. These particular ones have little screws on the end of these buttons, and what I discovered was some of these buttons, like this one, are really loose. They're probably about to fall off. These screws on top just tighten those buttons up, like this half of this one, so that it doesn't wiggle about. This one wiggles, this one doesn't. It just makes your tuning more stable because you've got more control over the turning of those buttons, whereas this is all over the place and it's all spinny, and it's, you just, yeah. Make sure the screws are not so tight you can't turn it obviously, but tight enough so that the buttons aren't wobbling about. This little device here in the middle of the headstock is a string tree. When the strings come over, especially on these style of guitars, the guitar necks, the strings come on and are at a different tension all the way across here. And the best way for strings to be is at the same tension. So what the string tree does is it pulls the strings down to hopefully make the strings all equal tension across the headstock. That's the intent of them. Here is a guitar with a tilted back headstock. Notice how it tilts on its way back. And there's no need for string trees here because the angle of the headstock instantly makes all of the strings lie at the same tension. Whereas on a neck like this one, without the angle, you need that string tree to bring down the strings to make them all at the same tension. So that's the intent of them. They're very important to have if you've got a guitar neck this style. One last thing on the neck is that if the guitar has a whammy bar or vibrato bridge, then it may have one of these. Now this guitar is kind of special in the way that it has the nut and then it has this, which is the locking nut. The strings come in here, are locked in place, and it's so that strings don't slip and they should stay in tune even when you're dive bombing with a whammy bar. Sometimes these are bolted directly in place of the nut. I maybe see that on Ibanez's or on Jackson's or just about anywhere else. But this one has it behind the nut, which is kind of advantageous because it means you can have a different material for your nut and still keep the tone and then have it clamped. These, basically the strings come through here and then these little bolts go in on top and just clamp down on the strings to prevent them going anywhere, locked in place, and the strings won't slip and go out of tune. So I'm going to put this neck back together. I'm going to cut this new nut and hopefully be fine. I'll have to deal with the frets as well because there's a couple of fret tipping, and I just noticed that this last fret here, can you see that? It's just starting to pull out, which is terrible. I'll have to hammer that back in and hopefully not break anything. Should be okay. Should get that back in. But, yeah, okay. We'll move on to the body next.